Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Also to Anne and Hugh for the invitation and some of the conversations we were able to have in the lead up. And I think, as is typical for Jess and I when we front up to classes with and guide our interdisciplinary teams, we're in awe of the expertise in this room that we don't have. So I expect we'll be learning as much from you. We'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge and pay our respects to traditional owners of the land. In our case, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's on their lands that the University of Sydney was built. And we would also like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge the traditional owners on the various lands that you're based. So the Victorian Aboriginal people, as the first peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the land and water on which Victoria relies, and where your courts and programs take place. If ever there is an environment of complexity, it's clear that it is yours. So just to kick us off, and Jess and I will move through this together, but I might just start us off by really saying that in this presentation, we want to both acknowledge the role and really rich importance of diverse collaboration, but at the same time to acknowledge that collaboration and diversity is incredibly hard. In fact, simply putting a diverse group of people together will generally not achieve the type of integration that spurs a collective capacity for analysis, creativity, innovation, which ideally exceeds the capacity that we have as individuals working on our own. And in this sense, and don't you love it when a picture supports what you're saying? In this sense, I think we can think of an assembled group like a set of ingredients. They have the potential to make a fantastic dish, but we need a tried recipe. We need some cooking skills, which I admit I don't have in the kitchen at least, to actually get that recipe to realise that potential. So today, what we really want to talk to you about is what we've learned across the last few years, delivering project-based interdisciplinary learning for senior undergraduates at the University of Sydney. So that's our context, and the caveat is we know that this is quite different from yours. In this context, though, we ask students to work in interdisciplinary groups for 80% of their assessment work. So for me personally, I've had the privilege of mentoring and supervising at the latest count 135 interdisciplinary teams in face-to-face collaboration, but also in the last 3 years in online and hybrid collaboration. And that, of course, which isn't the focus of our presentation today, but that brings another level of complexity, and I would say as well opportunity for how teams can actually function across diversity. So the experience, I think, has produced for us a few key lessons. One is that there is such a high value for collaboration across diversity in terms of targeting complexity, but equally, there's a step that does need to be taken. There's a critical importance in helping teams to understand and navigate the kinds of cultural boundaries that multidisciplinary, diverse collaboration throws up. And also that there's an untapped potential of deeper forms of integration when it works. So not all diverse collaborations actually achieve the levels of integration that might be possible. So just to paint a little bit more of a picture before I hand over to Jess, in the teaching context we're in, industry and community partners will bring us a real world problem, a real world complex problem for an interdisciplinary group to independently analyse, research and hopefully solve. This marriage of interdisciplinarity and complexity is really well established in the literature, and I think it's worthwhile just looking at some of the key drivers for this interest in education and in practice in interdisciplinary collaboration. So the National Association of Science, their Academy of Science, has put up 4 drivers. And the first of these is recognising that, yes, nature and society are inherently complex. It took us a while to grapple with that and understand that. And that, you know, problems are emerging on the boundaries of disciplines, and we're finding it increasingly hard to grapple with problems within disciplinary silos. The urgency and the need to solve societal problems, but also the opportunities that come from new generative technologies that are throwing up new possibilities to old problems. And I'm just reminded of one project that I worked on recently with the New South Wales Department of Environment, Industry and Planning. And a group was looking at the potential of using drone technology for counting koalas. So on that, I might hand over to Jess quickly just to provide some examples of the kinds of problems and partners we've tackled more related to the space that you're working in.
Thanks, Lizzie. So hi, everybody. Thanks for having us today. I wanted to give you a sense of, this is just a little taste of some of the different projects that we work with in the industry and community project units. So as Lizzie described, what we have is a range of industry and community partners. These could be business, massive corporations through to little not-for-profits, government agencies. We've had local partners and we've also had international partners. And what we ask them to do is to take a good hard look at their own organisation or their industry and to think about genuine, unresolved, complex and challenging problems that they're facing. And not just hard problems in the sense that, this is a tricky thing that would require, say, the best and brightest mind from a particular field to solve. We want complex problems, ones that are messy and that would require, not just one brain or one perspective, but that necessarily, are not just open to, but in fact invite, require multiple perspectives to think about. So some of the examples that I've got here are projects that Lizzie and I have worked on, but we have worked with 70 partners as a teaching group. There are more of us teaching these projects. So some I'll draw your attention to. I've run a project on the future of domestic violence prevention, for example, a few times in partnership with a not-for-profit Kia. We've also worked on the issue of diversity and leadership, or in fact, more properly, the problems of lack of diversity in leadership in the public service. And that was through the New South Wales Public Service Commission, who asked students to really grapple with what would it take to address the ongoing and challenging problem of homogeneity in our leadership structures, not just in the public service, but in fact in many organisations. So these are the kinds of juicy problems that our students get presented with. They are encouraged to pick a project that is meaningful to them, that is interesting to them. They can pick one that clearly aligns with their discipline, but they're also very welcome and encouraged to pick one where the relationship to their home units of study is not necessarily clear. Because what we want to do is to generate groups of students who are a genuine interdisciplinary mix. So our classrooms need to have law students, they need to have science students, they need to have humanities students, they need to have social work students. We draw from across the university and we make sure we compose our classrooms reflecting the diversity of disciplinary areas that we teach here at the University of Sydney. Students are then in a typical semester given 13 weeks to grapple with this one brief that their partner has offered them. Generally speaking, we'll divide the class up into 8 to 10 groups of 5 to 6 students in each group. And these students will have well, the way that I teach it anyway, I'm not sure if all of my colleagues do the same, but they don't have choice in who their group teammates are. We compose those groups based on the disciplinary mix that we need to achieve, because one of the things that we want to challenge our students to do is to really grapple with difference and different ways of thinking through these projects. So to give you a little indication, here's a word cloud that I made with the majors of my students in my current project, which is about putting intersectionality at the heart of gender equality policy, which is a project that I'm working on in partnership with Elisabeth Broderick and co. So you can see that I've got students in my classroom who you might expect to be in that kind of a project, perhaps students who are studying politics, international relations, perhaps even students who are studying business or gender. You might think, yeah, I can expect that those students might be in a project about policy and intersectionality. But I also have financial math students. I also have students who are studying Korean studies. I also have students who are studying anatomy. And all of these students need to find ways to work together meaningfully over the course of 13 weeks, kind of sight unseen, perfect strangers, some of whom you may not have even ever heard that their discipline existed before you were put in a group with that person. And together you need to find a way through to have one unified collaborative project that respects your disciplinary differences, that utilizes those disciplinary differences and responds in a meaningful way to the brief of the partner. And then we present back to the partner at the end of the semester. So I think I'll throw back to Lissy now to talk us through some definitions around interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and multidisciplinarity.
So that, yeah, thank you. And that context hopefully helps you to understand the kinds of insights hopefully we can give you based on the kinds of groupings and scenarios we've had. Because of course, one of the things that we do need to recognise is some collaborations aren't organically sought out, but they're forced. And how do you navigate an interdisciplinary collaboration when it's not something you've pursued yourself and you know who you're inviting in and what expertise they will bring? But it is worthwhile pausing for a minute to think about some key terminology that prevails in the literature on interdisciplinary research and collaboration, because this helps us to reveal some of the different types of collaboration we might encounter and that we might aspire to. And I think that makes it appropriate to, for our session to be talking about multidisciplinary, because this is sort of as a baseline what we might expect in that definition here. It involves having more than one discipline present. This is how we achieve multidisciplinary collaboration, but those lenses are not necessarily integrated. This could be where, and you may recall this, where you've worked in an interdisciplinary team, you've delegated the work, the economics person does their economic analysis, the legal person does their legal analysis, but they haven't really learned each other's approaches and thought about ways in which they could synthesize insights from both. So that siloing may still be happening. In interdisciplinary teams, there needs to be some form of integration present across the methods, across the theories, across the concepts, across the data you're using, the perspectives you're leveraging. And then in transdisciplinary work, which is partly what we try to aspire to do, there also needs to be an integration with non-academic knowledge and stakeholders. Keistra and Mencken, the authors popped up there, argue that it's possible to move across these frameworks actually within individual collaborations and projects. So one of the key things to think about in terms of working within an interdisciplinary group and how to make that work is what your goals for that collaboration are. And in part, whether you achieve one of these models may in itself have to do with the problem you're trying to solve. Not all problems require a transdisciplinary approach. What stakeholders need to be represented, what disciplines need to be represented. The other, which is part of what we really want to draw out in looking at the way we guide through students through reflective activities to enable this, the other is really about the culture that's established in the group that allows team members to ask the questions, contribute their ideas, and build a safe and collaborative environment to really activate all the disciplines and insights present and give them opportunities to integrate those knowledge bases as well. So that's what we'll move this conversation into in terms of what kind of reflective work needs to happen to ensure all voices are heard at the table. So I'll hand over to Jess to talk through some of the forms of negotiation that need to take place. And she can draw on some relevant examples from her teaching as well.
So one of the things that we set out to do is, I mean, so a fascinating phenomenon actually is when you get a group of students together, no matter how different their disciplines are, and you sit them down at the table, most student groups, almost all student groups, will be oriented towards primarily getting along and avoiding conflict with each other. And it's really interesting because while that's kind of very pro-social of them, and it can produce harmonious group work on the surface, sometimes they're missing a trick there, because they are at times burying fruitful, meaningful differences between them in favor of harmonious relations. And one of the things that we've learned is that you almost have to draw out, or encourage students to draw out and reflect on their differences, which is perhaps counterintuitive. Like often when you're thinking about how to help a group get along, you might think about drawing out things where they're the same. But actually, for this kind of work, where we really want them to harness the skill sets and ways of thinking that they bring with them from their different disciplines, we need to start by drawing attention to those differences in the first place. So here's one little trick that I use with my class early on to get them to think about the very big differences in what people study at the university. So I call it the strange object of study activity, and I throw up a range of things that could be studied. And I do it in a Padlet, and I'll pop that in the link. Actually, see if you have access to it in the notes, if you could pop it in the link, because it's hard for me to get to right now. Pop it in the chat for people in case they're curious. But here's what I do. I pop up in Padlet a series of different potential objects of study. And I try and think outside the box, although I'm sure that it's still shaped fundamentally by me being a gender and cultural studies scholar. And so some of these projects, some of these objects of study are things that I would find interesting, but I do try and reach a little bit to things that are beyond what I would do as well. And then I challenge students and their groups to come up with as many different ways from their own disciplines that they could study these different objects. So if you were to come across, for example, the Bachelorette in your field of work, how would it be studied, if at all, right? And one of the insights that this generates is that for some students, there are objects of study here where they could not imagine not only themselves studying it, but some of them, they're like, I don't really know how this could be studied in a legitimate fashion at all. And it draws out their assumptions about what research looks like, what good work looks like, what's useful knowledge, how do you go about getting useful knowledge, and it kind of surfaces those differences at the start of semester. So I'll give you one example. I'll zoom in on sushi, and this is because it was one of the ones where I got surprised by the differences my students were bringing in a way that I found very delightful. So I asked them, right, how would you study sushi? And some of them you might imagine. So yes, there were nutritionists who said, well, you'd analyze the nutritional content. Some people said I'd look at what we would look in my discipline at what microorganisms are present and how that might affect food deterioration. Veterinarian scientists said, well, we would look at the treatment of fish during production. There were students more from my neck of the woods who would say, okay, let's analyze food cultures. Let's think about cultural exchange. Let's think about change. Let's think about what sushi looks like in Australia versus what sushi looks like in Japan. There were other students who said, let's think about the social and economic global effects of overfishing, or food choice and socialization and ideology in food. And then there was one student who was like, yeah, we'd design a sushi cutting robot. And that was their discipline's response to it. Now, that would make so much sense if you were in mechanical engineering or robotics. But to me, it was completely unanticipated. I had not imagined when I put the picture of sushi up that someone's degree would involve them looking at sushi and saying, how can I make the production line more efficient if I built a robot? And that blew me out of the water. So these are the kinds of differences that we want students to start thinking about. I also get them to think about, what does assessment look like in your discipline? What does success look like in your discipline? Or to throw back to a chat that Anne and Lissy and I were having before the call started with you all, what does good writing look like to you? What does good thinking look like to you? Because there were very different norms in different disciplines about these things. So what does that look like when we then turn to an actual project, one of the ones that our partners have given us? So I'm going to take for a minute the diversity and leadership project that I mentioned earlier. So we had a range of students in that classroom, as you would expect, and some of the students came in and thought, okay, we've got a problem with diversity and leadership. Management is not diverse enough. Students from the business school who had management majors or HR majors, they were coming up with potential solutions that were about, let's think about work life cycle maps. Let's think about where does a person enter the workplace and what are the blockages along their work life cycle. There were psychology students who said, look, maybe what we need to be doing is thinking about unconscious bias. Maybe we need to be testing for that. Maybe we need to be thinking about educational psychology and what would create change, what's effective change mechanism in these organizations. There were history students who were thinking about, and in fact, Indigenous studies and gender studies students who might be thinking about longer term picture of structural injustice, or thinking about dynamics in society and how these shape what goes on within an organization and what we need to do to account for that. We had science people who had skill sets around measurement and statistics, who really wanted to be able to pin something down and measure it and change it. And I got into a really fascinating conversation in one of these classrooms with a psychology student. We were talking about different methods between our disciplines. So I'm from gender and cultural studies and they were from psychology. And they were saying in their discipline or their way of thinking, they couldn't imagine what research would look like if you weren't trying to pin down something measurable. To them, that is what knowledge looks like. And what would it mean for me to think conceptually about something like racism or something like sexism? If I wasn't measuring something, how could I call that knowledge? So we got into this little friendly debate about what the nature of knowing something like diversity or the lack of it looks like, and realized that, you know, depending on how you set up the question or how you look at it, you get very different answers about the possible solutions. So to this psychology student, what we came to understand was that they were primarily seeing something like racism or sexism as a question of individual bias. And to their mind, what we needed to do was develop a robust tool for measuring that bias and then intervening in it, whether that be through some sort of a cultural shift for the individual or by firing the people who we discovered to be racist. That was their solution to racism in the organizations. But I had quite a different conception of what racism looked like that was perfectly compatible with there being no one actively discriminatory within an organization. My version of racism was much more to do with structures of power across society, and it was possible to produce inequitable results within an organization, even if everyone was doing their level best to be quote unquote inclusive. So that kind of structural privileging, say, of whiteness or of certain sorts of cultural norms, I didn't feel that could be addressed solely through individualized testing. And we kind of came to some mutual understanding of the value and differences between our perspectives there and what we each could and could not do. I couldn't measure something for the life of me, but this student also was, I guess the measurement focus gave her a bit of tunnel vision and meant that the version of the problem that she was seeing was quite thin compared to the mapping that I was wanting to do. And these both had their strengths and they both had their weaknesses. I'll give you one more example of what this kind of interdisciplinarity can yield. So the Future of Domestic Violence Prevention is a project I've run a few times in partnership with KIA, which is an education program that runs in schools, a not-for-profit. So we had a lot of different students with a lot of different disciplines in the room, including some veterinarian students. So these students were vets in training. Their study looked mostly at animal behaviour and animal welfare and animal diseases. This is what they spent their 3 years at university learning about. And one of these students was feeling quite stuck in their group at not really having anything of substance to offer. So they were making themselves a very flexible generalist. They were doing their best to help their group with the work, but they kind of saw themselves as really not having anything themselves to contribute from their disciplinary perspective. But we got chatting, and I really pushed them to dig into their discipline and think about, is there any link here? And what they found was, what they knew from their studies is that there's a correlation between domestic and family violence and violence towards pets. And that insight gave a whole new intervention point to their group who would not have thought of it otherwise, because we realized, look, actually, vets are potential first points of disclosure. Vets have a source of information that other professionals may not have, but they also are not necessarily trained. So here's a real opportunity for change, where we could support a group of professionals in a meaningful way that have a chance to be that, to respond appropriately and well to domestic and family violence, and to help link people up to services. And that was not being addressed in vet training, and so there's an opportunity here for real change. Now that insight, I really doubt would have happened unless we'd had a vet student in the group who was committed to the idea of offering something themselves and not just sidelining themselves, not just trying to be a generalist in the room, and who had teammates who were willing to look for that answer as well.
Okay, and I won't sit on this long, but I just want to pick up on what Jess said. It's how do we get that voice that doesn't see themselves as being relevant to be heard? How do you create an environment that makes it comfortable for them to speak up? And just as a quick underscore, we see in the last iterations of the World Economic Forum's top 10 employability skills, complex problem solving, but alongside that, the types of interpersonal skills that support this. So where we think we need to teach our groups, our students about interdisciplinarity, we're often teaching them some broader interpersonal skills about and reflective skills that enable them to tap their own biases, that enable them to be socialized and open to the values of other ways of thinking. So I might move on from that one already and really focus in now on how you kind of break those barriers that, as I said, get that vet student in Jess's group to speak. Breaking out of our long learned ways of thinking and approaching problem solving is easier said than done, I think. And this is where we've experienced there are a lot of hidden barriers to collaboration in terms of biases and assumptions about ourselves and others that we may not be fully cognizant of. And this, as well as where there's a discipline that seems to have a clear link to a problem, such as maybe law to violence against women or social work, and the vet doesn't see themselves fitting in there. Often the business students see that they have the answers for a lot of the problems that are set by corporates as well. There can be a tendency toward what's called in the literature disciplinary defaulting. So we've already kind of know that this discipline actually has the answer, and everybody else is really arming them, getting behind that discipline, or not feeling confident to bring their own ways of thinking and viewing the problem to the fore. If we consider, as Blackwell does, that disciplines themselves foster unique values and cultures, then we also get more of a sense of there's actually a lot to break down here in terms of, getting entry into that and building a shared culture that actually facilitates more voices to be heard.
And I just wanted to add, sorry, Lucy, here, because I've got my little footnote here. Blackwell talks about developing a shared value and culture within a team, but I would also add that the capacity to recognize, respect, and collaborate between cultures rather than trying to, force a unity that isn't there can sometimes be more respectful and productive in its own right as well. Sorry
Yeah.
to butt in.
No, absolutely. But I think, the key takeaway is to embrace interdisciplinarity. We actually need to grapple with our disciplines a little bit, with the silos that we have been in. And this in itself involves a self-awareness of the features and bounds of your own discipline. Questions we often haven't been asked, we haven't been prompted to ask in our studies, and we may not have been asked in work environments where our own values are reflected back at us. So not only to understand our own disciplines, but by locating them in a broader landscape to build an appreciation of others. It's under those conditions that you can start to have an opening up, a questioning mind, a reflective practice that allows you to engage with others. These are processes that Klein calls, firstly, gaining disciplinary depth, knowing your own discipline, knowing its assumptions, knowing its strengths, knowing its weaknesses, which then allows you to actually ask questions of the vet student and others, to get an appreciation of what other disciplines do, what value they may add. And it's only through that mutual learning that the possibilities for how you could integrate become visible. So I might give an example now of how I kind of do this softly, but I would say with some humor in my classes. The work really, that reflective work, needs to happen in a team. But as a socialization in my class, I get them to synchronously mind map in disciplinary groupings and to share with others what their key theories are, what their key methods, what key assumptions in their disciplines are, but also to share any assumptions they think others have about them. And it's quite surprising how little we know about the nuts and bolts of what different disciplines do. Have you found yourself at a table with an accountant and made assumptions, as others did, that their main aim is tax return, their main work is tax returns, yeah? Or geographers have this sense that others just view them as colouring in maps and knowing all the capital cities. Psychologists, seeing others having perceptions of them that they'll be judgmental. Musicians there shared that there is a performance, a creative component to what they do, but there's also analysis and interpretation work, which can really be adapted to other contexts. But they feel they face this stereotype that will always perform for you. So this kind of activity, this kind of, this initial onboarding in a team is really important. Sharing information about the kinds of values that you bring, the kind of very practical work that you do, and learning that about others. Those are the ways we start to activate disciplinary depth for ourselves, but also get an appreciation of what other disciplines can do. So a key technique for us is we get student groups regularly to reflect, whether it's individually or through a team charter type activity, so that they can start to engage in that process. And I had, a reflection in one of these works from a law student. Being with people from different disciplines makes you realise things about your own discipline. Preconceptions, approaches and ways of thinking. I realised that law is more rigid than I originally thought, and it has a very specific way of approaching problems. So this decentering of discipline is really fundamental if you're going to engage with others in a more accessible way. Jess.
Yeah, so then I want us to just take a moment to think about the fact that, of course, in these groups and in professional collaborations as well, people are not just their disciplines or their professions, and people are not just one thing. So in our groups, this is an area of a bit of complexity, because you can get stuck on thinking about differences in, I guess, kind of headline ways, like, oh, is there a gender difference going on at this table, or is there a cultural difference going on at this table? And while those patterns are absolutely worth analysing, I mean, that's my bread and butter in my discipline, thinking about these structures across society, the way that they play out in, between 5 particular people in a room is patterned, but not always predictable. And you can sometimes have a blunting effect, or it can end up feeling a bit thin if you try and impose those big note things about, like, well, in society, women tend to do this and men tend to do that, therefore that's what's happening in my group. I mean, sometimes that can be true, but oftentimes there's more complexity going on because people are not just one thing ever. So to try and bridge or mediate the gap between people's social and political analyses and people's sense of what goes on within a group, I tend to try and focus the mind for students on really concrete things, like in your discipline, family or culture, what is considered appropriate ways to speak and to listen? When's it your turn? How do you know? How do you know someone else is listening to you? How do you disagree with somebody else? Or what's the right protocol for negotiating? Those things do change, discipline to discipline. I mean, I guess we could just say culture to culture and recognize that disciplines can have their own cultures. We also need to recognize that within groups, people will have their own different abilities, responsibilities, skill sets, and priorities inside and outside of the group work. Importantly, to my mind, people also bring with them different histories of treatment and of inclusion or exclusion by the dominant cultures and the institutions that you're working with. So while perhaps, for example, everyone might technically have the same right to speak and everyone in the group might want everyone else to speak, not everyone in the group will feel the same degree of entitlement to speak or will feel like their voice is welcome. Something in the chat, 5 minutes, sorry. Okay, so I won't take long on this. We can talk more to it later about how we exercise these kinds of, enact these reflections or encourage our students to make these reflections, to reflect on those differences and then to scale it back up and think about where that's come from in terms of disciplinary culture or personal experience or personal cultural background. We can talk about that later if people are interested. So I try and get my group, and I think this is a good model for not just small group work as well, to think across 3 different types of barriers that can happen when you're trying to collaborate with others. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about inclusion, difference, and exclusion, people think about interpersonal barriers. They think, all right, is there anything discriminatory going on here? Is there any active hostility or exclusion? Is there favoritism in the room? That's usually, I mean, not always, but it is often fairly easy to spot if it's happening, and people will usually want it to be actioned if it's clear that something like that is happening. But oftentimes groups won't see or own up to if it is happening, and I'm happy to report that in most of my groups, most of the time, people are genuinely wanting to be nice and include each other and genuinely attempting at least to operate without those kinds of explicit biases, which is not to say that inequalities or exclusions don't happen in the groups. So what I get them to think about is things like institutional barriers or the group equivalent of it. So this might be in an organization, you might think about policy, you might think about leave, you might think about hiring policies, you might think about systems that end up having discriminatory results. In our groups, we might think about how workload is negotiated, what's in the group charter, how do we, what mechanisms do we have to disagree with each other well, and what have we agreed to in that way? But really crucially, I want students to think about this third one, the cultural barriers, the stuff that's not so black and white. So this is the things like the values that the group has defaulted to or that individuals within the group have brought with them. This could be to do with ways of being, like how do you speak up? Do you speak up? How do you indicate that you disagree with someone respectfully? What kind of knowledge do you value? What do you think good work looks like? All of the stuff we've been talking about in the presentation so far can actually come back in the group and end up having uneven results in terms of who feels included, whose voice is listened to and respected, even when everyone in the group is committed to working well and respectfully to each other, even when people are doing their level best to not exclude anyone, even when the group processes are good. If those underlying values have defaulted to one particular discipline or one particular culture, and in Australia that's often kind of Eurocentric ways of articulating things, the way that white people tend to work with other white people tends to be the way that groups default to. So if that stuff isn't addressed, if that's not surfaced and discussed and navigated through, you can still end up having results where people are excluded or are and feel excluded. I'm going to skip that because I want to get to the end, and I notice we're nearly out of time. Lizzie.
Well, I think it's good to I guess, really land on these pages, which again, some insights from students on their experience of some of the barriers that may be bigger than the disciplinary barriers themselves, or impede getting to that conversation about discipline. One here looking at Chinese culture and how communication, how that informed that student's communication styles and expectations, and language being a real barrier, dialects being a real barrier, and that there are really good ways, simple ways to manage that. Right. But I appreciate as well in this final comment, it was the team charter that allowed me to feel represented in my group and positive that we would be able to work together as a team effectively. I see this now in the interdisciplinary collaborations I do, including the one with Jess. There are just important conversations that you actually need to take time to have, to surface potential barriers, to surface ways of thinking and working, and to really set expectations that allow more voices to be heard.
Wonderful. What an amazing presentation. My mind is just going overboard here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Magistrate Spencer, and everybody for coming along and spending your time. Thank you.
Great. And we'll see you at the next one, everyone. Have a great afternoon.